Good morning. The Subcommittee on Technology and Innovation of the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will come to order. Pursuant to notice, the Subcommittee on Technology and Innovation meets to consider the following measure: H.R. 2463, the Border Security Technology Innovation Act of 2011. We will now proceed with the markup, beginning with opening statements, and I will begin. Today we will consider H.R. 2463, the Border Security Technology Innovation Act of 2011. This bill was introduced by Chairman Hall on July 8th and referred to both our subcommittee and the Committee on Homeland Security. H.R. 2463 authorizes research and development activities of the Department of Homeland Security's Science and Technology Directorate that are focused on improving the technologies used to protect our border. In my home state of Arizona, I can say with certainty that our border is far from secure. A recent GAO study found that only 44% of the southwest border was under operational control. This is clearly unacceptable. I have introduced legislation, H.R. 1922, that will finally allow the U.S. Border Patrol complete access to federal lands. This is vital in Arizona, where federal lands constitute approximately 83% of the 370-mile border between Arizona and Mexico. The legislation we are considering today will further assist these agents by helping to develop cutting-edge technologies to support their efforts to secure our country's borders. The Border Security Technology Innovation Act is not just limited to land border crossings, but also addresses detection technologies necessary to effectively monitor and control the country's ports of entry. This legislation has been introduced in previous Congresses and has received broad bipartisan support. I am pleased this is continued today with Ranking Member Wu's decision to join me as an original co-sponsor of this legislation. I appreciate his support and look forward to working with him to move this important legislation forward. I now yield the balance of my time to the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Hall, for any comments he may have.
Mr. Chairman Quayle, thank you very much for holding the markup and for your co-sponsorship. And Mr. Wu, immigration is so important, and it's one of several bills. And when we do approach really being serious about doing immigration, they'll combine a lot of these bills, and we feel sure that this will be combined in with them, and I think it's an important part. I think that securing the nation's border is certainly a crucial issue for Congress to address. It would have been a lot easier if we'd addressed it maybe 15 years ago. That was at a time when people were coming across the border and looking for work, and they did better work than most anybody else. They did it cheaper. They were responsible. You could rely on them, and because they were family people, they'd live on about 2% of what they made and send the rest back to a hungry family in Mexico. So there's something good about people like that. We should have worked something out with them then. It's going to take a long time to do it now, but this will be part of the bill, I think, when we do finally get to it. And I do want to say a few words about it, because we have nearly 7,500 miles of land border with Canada and Mexico, over which nearly 1 million passengers and pedestrians and 47,000 truck, rail, and sea containers pass per day. To effectively monitor and control the border, the appropriate mix of technology, infrastructure, and personnel is important for the Department of Homeland Security to continue to improve the security of our nation's borders. I introduced H.R. 2463 to reduce our vulnerabilities at the border. This bill focuses on special border scrutiny technology programs and instructs the Science and Technology Directorate at the Department of Homeland Security to improve processes for setting research priorities in order to better serve the needs of technology end users. Further research has the potential to significantly improve our border security defenses against a wide range of threats, including illegal immigration, human trafficking, drug smuggling, terrorism, and on and on. Legislation focuses on key long-term endeavors that will help local, state, and national agents control our borders, will also ensure that we carefully plan and coordinate border technology so that we protect the American taxpayers. I urge my colleagues to join me in support H.R. 2463 today. I believe this committee is ideally positioned to strengthen control of our nation's borders through this legislation, supporting an effective, efficient, and evolving border defenses. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again for having this hearing.
I thank Mr. Chairman for his comments. I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Wu, for 5 minutes to present his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this subcommittee markup today on the Border Security Technology Innovation Act of 2011. I think that it's fair to say that everyone on this subcommittee, on both sides of the aisle, agrees that the border security technology research taking place at the Department of Homeland Security is important and should be continued. I certainly do. That is why I held a hearing on this issue in 2007 when I was chairman of this subcommittee, and why I supported Chairman Hall's bill at that time, and that bill reiterates and reemphasizes the importance of this ongoing research. It is also why I'm supporting it once again in this Congress. I wholeheartedly agree with Chairman Hall that we should ensure support for the science and technology programs that aid our current and future Border Patrol efforts. Of course, we would be remiss if we didn't recognize that many things have changed since this bill first moved through the committee in 2007. We have a new administration with new priorities and initiatives. We have an S&T directorate that underwent a significant reorganization at the end of last year, and which is making strides to prioritize its research and focus in the areas of highest need and greatest risk, something that I have pressed the S&T directorate to do for some time. We have a slew of new members in this committee, and we have a change in who's in charge on this committee. We have a number of members who were not on this committee 4 years ago. That being the case, I think that it would have been very useful to have had a hearing on this issue before fast-tracking this legislation to markup. Such a hearing would have provided the members of this committee an opportunity to learn about specific border security activities currently underway at the S&T Directorate, and to identify new areas of research that need to be or should be addressed. Such a hearing would have allowed us to exercise our oversight obligations and to legislate as responsibly and effectively as I think we should. In addition, when we first considered this bill, the fiscal climate was different. There's no denying that we have come to an important crossroad with respect to the federal budget. We now spend a lot of time focused on how much programs cost and how much they can be cut. Unfortunately, the S&T Directorate at DHS has not emerged from this process unscathed. In fact, after already suffering a significant cut in the fiscal year 2011 continuing resolution, funding for research and development activities at the Directorate was cut by a staggering 77% after you take out the mandated costs and activities. According to DHS, this proposed cut would force the Directorate to eliminate the vast majority of its ongoing research, including all, and I emphasize all, border security research. Simply put, if the proposed House Homeland Security Appropriations Bill is enacted into law, the S&T Directorate will not have the funds it would need to carry out the research that this bill mandates. There's a lot of talk these days about the need to make tough choices in these budgetary times. Unfortunately, one of the tough choices the majority made in the Homeland Security Appropriations Bill was to end border security research programs at the Department of Homeland Security, including those authorized by this exact bill. That being said, if we agree that the research mandated in this bill is important, we simply have to be willing to provide the funding that is needed to carry it out. This research has a price tag which cannot be ignored. Chairman Quayle, I look forward to working with you and Chairman Hall on this legislation as it moves forward, and I hope that we can work together to ensure that the Directorate has the resources it needs to actually carry out this valuable research. And, Mr. Chairman, although I am pleased to be a co-sponsor of the bill and strongly support its objectives, I do have one question about the bill that I hope you can answer for me and clarify, which is that both Section 6 on unmanned aerial vehicles and Section 8 on anti-counterfeit technologies include directives to other agencies or entities within the federal government, in one case the Joint Planning and Development Office, and in the other to NIST. Since the bill specifies that funding is to be made available under Section 307 of the Homeland Security Act, I am assuming that the intent is that funding for the JDPO and NIST portions of these programs will come from the Department of Homeland Security and not the budgets of these other agencies. Is my understanding correct?
If gentleman yields, I'll have to ask counsel this. Is the question that Mr. Wu is stating, my understanding is that it does not come directly from Homeland Security. It comes from the various agencies, but if you could clarify, that'd be great.
The language as written would not alter the relationship between the Department of Homeland Security and the Joint Planning and Development Office. It would simply instruct DHS and JPDO to continue their work together, directing research within, in Section 6, within the unmanned aerial vehicles FAA airspace area. Within Section 8, the language continues the coordination that is occurring between DHS and NIST. There's actually, as I read it, no direction to NIST other than a comment on said coordination.
I'm sorry. The one thing is that if there is some ambiguity in the language of the bill, I'd be happy to work with you and with Chairman Hall going forward before we get to full committee to clean up the language to make it a little more specific so there's not as much ambiguity as you guys find right now.
Reclaiming my time, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and directing my comment to counsel. It's my understanding that when some directives are for joint activities, that the implication is that there is a 50-50 split of responsibility for covering the cost. And I would hope that this being primarily a Homeland Security R&D or Research Directorate bill, that the costs fall primarily or exclusively on Homeland Security, and that to the extent it falls on other agencies, that we provide adequately to those other agencies.
Well, in terms of Section 6, which I believe you're referring to, the joint program between DHS and JPDO, the Secretary of DHS, as I understand, is a member of the JPDO Senior Policy Committee, which coordinates aviation research activities within the federal government. This committee is funded currently through the FAA, and my reading of 2463 is that it reinforces the need for DHS to consult with JPDO to prevent the duplication of research with other agencies.
Okay. I'm not sure if we're mulling through the same section or the correct section. Let's work further on this, and Chairman Quayle, I look forward to working with you to clarify this language, and if there is different intent, we can hash this out. And thank you for your indulgence and going over in time a little bit, but I think it's important to work on some clarification here. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wu, and I look forward to working on that language going forward. Without objection, all member opening statements will be placed in the record at this point. Also, without objection, I ask unanimous consent that the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point, and that the members proceed with the amendments in the order of the roster.
Mr. Chairman?
Yep.
I have a parliamentary inquiry.
Yes.
Before we get started, let me just say, as to the underlying bill, I'm supportive, and I commend Chairman Hall and Ranking Member Wu on their work on this. But I did want to just raise a question, because I think there's a provision in the bill that may be a defect when you compare it against the protocols of the committee, and then another provision that's missing that also implicates the procedures of the committee. This goes back to the rules that were adopted by the committee at the outset. Chairman Hall back in February, and in doing so, he was following, I think, Majority Leader Cantor's rules as they apply more broadly in the House, but he indicated that the committee will no longer consider bills that authorize, quote, such sums as may be necessary in authorizing language. And then there was another protocol that any program that gets authorized or reauthorized by this committee will have a sunset provision, ensuring that it doesn't extend past 7 years in terms of the authorization, at least past the first fiscal year. And as I say, these are consistent. The rules that Chairman Hall set forth, of course, were consistent with the ones the Majority Leader indicated would apply across the board to the committees in the House. But if you look at the bill, I think it may have a problem with those two protocols. There is a provision in terms of authorizing the amounts, the funding here, which there's a provision that ties back to a 2002 authorization. And that provision talks about such sums as are necessary. So in effect, you're incorporating by reference a provision that has the kind of language in it that the rules of the committee appear to prohibit. So that's the first issue that I just wanted to present from a parliamentary standpoint. And the second is there doesn't appear to be a provision in this bill that would have it sunset within that 7-year period. And so I just want to clear up any confusion about that. Whether it's a fair construction, an acceptable construction that you can refer back in this way, and if so, if there are Democratic bills that do the same, will those pass muster under the rules of the committee, or is there a problem here?
I thank you for the inquiry, and I'll take the second part first in terms of sunsetting. The manager's amendment that is going to be offered in about 2 seconds by Chairman Hall deals with that and has it sunset and carry out. It changes the language that for fiscal years 2012 to 2014, so it does it in 2 years. That's the first part. And then the other part in terms, I think that the language is drafted clarifies that the funding for these activities comes from the amounts that are authorized by the Science and Technology Directorate of the Homeland Security. We're still working with our colleagues at the Homeland Security Committee, as they work towards reauthorization of the department, which we agreed is needed. Further, we continue to work with the CBO to examine appropriate spending for these programs as informed by the department's spending history on these activities. So we're still working through that process, and we will be continuing forward until we get to full committee.
Well, I note that as currently drafted, it refers back to Section 307 of the Homeland Security Act of 2002. And if you look at that provision, it says authorization of appropriations of $500 million for fiscal year 03 and such sums as may be necessary thereafter. So at this point, it appears to incorporate a provision that allows for unlimited sums, which would seem to contravene the protocol of the committee, and that's what we're trying to clear up.
Well, the protocols of the committees are not needed to be at the start of when the bill is introduced. They will be worked out during the process of this markup and the markup of the full committee so that they are actually, when the bill is actually passed out of the full committee, then all the protocols will be abided by.
I appreciate your time. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. So without objection, I ask unanimous consent that the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point, and that members proceed with the amendments in the orders of the roster. Are there any amendments to the bill? For what,
Chairman,
for
I
what
have
purpose?
an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 008, amendment to H.R. 2463 offered by Mr. Hall of Texas.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman is now recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, the manager's amendment offered today makes a number of needed clarifications to H.R. 2463. First, the amendment removes the Government Accountability Office assessment of basic science research for border and maritime security. Rather than include the report in H.R. 2463, I'll provide a letter to the researchers at GAO requesting their timely analysis of border and maritime security research needs. And I would welcome members from both sides of the aisle, including the gentleman who made some good suggestions there, to join me in this request. Next, the amendment specifies a $1 million offset for the reauthorization of the Homeland Security Science and Technology Advisory Committee. The committee is an independent advisory body that encourages greater cooperation between the Department of Homeland Security and the private sector. The offset would simply reduce funding for an underperforming program at the department. Finally, the amendment clarifies the time period for the authorization of appropriations for carrying out the Border Security Technology Innovation Act as final years 2012 through 2014. With that, I ask the members to support my amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to offer my support for the amendment offered by the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Hall, and thank him for the clarifications he has made to the bill. The manager's amendment removes a GAO study from the legislation. I applaud Mr. Hall's decision to instead secure the study through a direct request to the GAO. This will ensure that analysis of our border research needs is conducted as soon as possible to inform the work of Congress and the Department of Homeland Security. Mr. Hall's amendment also identifies an offset to provide funding for the reauthorization of the Homeland Security Science and Technology Advisory Committee. We believe that the guidance this independent outside entity provides the Science and Technology Directorate is extremely valuable and helps ensure that the work the Directorate is conducting is truly addressing security needs. With this amendment, we are attempting to responsibly budget for an activity the Department will need to fund at approximately $1 million a year. The decision to use the First Responder Technologies Program as an offset for the Advisory Committee was a good faith effort to identify a program we believe to be underperforming. The offset will reduce funding for a program that includes a professional networking and social media platform for first responders, as well as an online newsletter and blog. This funding will be shifted to the Science and Technology Advisory Committee, which is representation from first responders, and provides scientific and technical advice to the Undersecretary for Science and Technology, helping to strengthen the technologies DHS deploys in the field. I look forward to continuing to work with Chairman Hall and other members of this committee, and I urge all my colleagues to support this amendment. Is there further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think that I want to commend Chairman Hall for his amendment. I am concerned, however, about this offset, and the offset, I think specifically, very clearly points out the problems of underfunding in this bill and underfunding in the overall Homeland Security appropriations process, because while the $1 million funding is important, the offset is in a critical area, and I believe that Chairman Hall and you, Mr. Chairman, referred to it as an underperforming area from where the offset is coming from, and specifically that's the IPTs and the First Responder Technologies Program. The IPTs are designed to encourage the Department of Homeland Security to pull in the user groups that would actually use the technologies developed by the Science Directorate. And quite frankly, the reason why it's underperforming is because, in my view, Homeland Security has not been very interested in collecting the information from the end user community and has resisted that. And so in the 2007 hearings which I held, I pressed the department very, very hard to pull in the user community in a more useful way, so that deployment issues and issues of use in the field would be better incorporated in its research. So, for example, you would not have puffer machines that, when deployed, would go down because of dust in the environment. This is absolutely crucial. The department has been resistant to this. I'm not surprised that it's been underperforming, but the solution is not to further cut the funding for this department, and I'm very troubled by this offset. And I think that this truly reemphasizes the challenges we face in underfunding crucial activities at the S&T Directorate. I'd be happy to yield to either chairman.
Yeah, thank the gentleman for yielding. And I understand where your concern is, and we all have concern about when we are reducing funding to first responders. However, this is not one of the areas that is critical to the first responders. We have $7.8 million that are authorized. We are removing $1 million. One of the areas that we are shifting the funding is from a Facebook-type program that has been used for a number of years to try to facilitate a community for first responders to communicate best practices and the like. But over the years, even though there's been a considerable amount of funding, there's only about 2,500 users out of, I think it's well over 1 or 2 million first responders that are in the United States. So what I believe that this is responsibly shifting 1 million, still leaving 7.8 million, 6.8 million that'll be authorized for these various programs, and I think that this is the right thing to do. This doesn't affect boots on the ground, and that's the one thing that I want to make sure that I'm clear on, and I yield back.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, reclaiming my time. If it is taking out of Facebook technology, I will have no complaints. But if we see deployment of next-gen puffer machines that go down or next-gen full-body imaging, we'll follow up with another conversation. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wu. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? The gentlelady from Florida.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Today I'd like to talk about one particular part of the manager's amendment that concerns me. The manager's amendment strikes Section 5 of the underlying bill. This section mandated that the GAO conduct an assessment of the basic science research needs in the border and maritime security domain. My understanding is that the majority struck this provision because the Congressional Budget Office scored it as having a cost, and the majority wanted to avoid that added cost. I also understand that the chairman of the subcommittee and full committee intend to write a letter to GAO requesting that they do the same assessment contemplated in Section 5. Now, just in case there is any confusion, if the GAO conducts an assessment at the request of the chairman in a letter, this assessment will cost the government the exact same amount of money as if the assessment were conducted pursuant to Section 5 of this bill. By striking Section 5 and instead requesting the assessment through a letter, the majority hasn't saved the taxpayers 1 single cent. All the majority has succeeded in doing is moving the cost of the assessment out of the CBO score of this bill. Let me be clear. Hiding the cost of this assessment does not eliminate the cost of the assessment. Mr. Chairman, I'm extremely sensitive to this because I offered an amendment to the SBIR bill in this subcommittee earlier this year, which was opposed by the majority due to its costs, which was very little. In fact, it was negligible. It seems disingenuous to me to impose my provision based on costs, only to turn around and figure out ways to take your own costs off the books and out of the spotlight. Where I'm from, that's called having your cake and eating it too. Mr. Chairman, I sincerely hope that in the future, the majority will take seriously its commitment to openness and transparency, and that it has repeatedly touted over this short history of Congress, transparency and openness. I look forward to working with you and the entire community in addressing the issue of illegal immigration, and I yield back my time.
I thank the lady for the inquiry, and I just want to clarify that this letter does not constitute any new spending. This is actually going to be coming out of the GAO's overall budget, which is actually authorized, so this does not actually add any additional spending. The reason that that the manager's amendment has changed the language to actually do it in a letter is because we would like to get this report as soon as possible. And this bill has died a couple of times in the Senate, and with that, so has the GAO report. And so if we take that out of this bill so that it doesn't have to rely on consent of the Senate, then we can send the letter to get that GAO report so we can get that valuable information. So I hope that clears up some of the confusion. And I yield to the gentlelady.
Mr. Chair, it seems to me as if it's a way to skirt around actually taking the money because you can't take it from the bill, or it's not allowed to be in the bill. So if you write the letter, you're really skirting the whole process by writing the letter for the appropriation rather than having it included in the bill. And that was my concern, because earlier on this was denied, that anything that had some sort of appropriation would not come out of this subcommittee.
I'd like to say again is that if it's actually in the bill, it's going to be new and additional spending. If it's not and it's a letter, it's actually spending that's already been appropriated and authorized. And so that's where the difference. And then the second one, like I said before, is that there have been instances with this bill in the past where it has died in the Senate and we couldn't even get a GAO report because it was included in the bill. We would like to get the GAO report. It's not additional spending. It's not new spending. And so that's why the manager's amendment has taken care of that. So,
Chairman,
Mr. Chair.
yeah, I yield to the chairman of the full
the
committee.
letter simply requested an analysis of the border and the maritime security research needs. And I've asked for welcome from both sides of the aisle to join me in that request if they want to. If they don't, they should vote against it.
Mr. Chair, just a
Yes.
question, another question. Has it been scored by CBO? The letter?
No, nothing's scored until it's actually reported out. And the CBO does not score letters.
The amount that you're asking for, what it will cost to, has to be scored.
The CBO will not report.
Scored by CBO.
The CBO will not score a letter, and the CBO will not score anything until it's actually reported out. So
that is a way to get around it.
no, it's like I said before. It's not a way to get around. What it is that there's two ways that is going on. This is not new spending. This is actually going to be using appropriated funds that GAO gets. And the second part of it is that because this bill has had trouble in the Senate before, we wanted to get the GAO report because it'll provide vital information, and that actually will not have to have Senate consent to be able to do that. And so those are the reasoning behind this manager's amendment. If there is no further discussion on the amendment, if no, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Okay. Are there any other amendments to the bill? For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 028, amendment to H.R. 2463, offered by Mr. Lujan of New Mexico.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and very much appreciate the efforts of our chairman offering this legislation as well, and very much support what we're attempting to accomplish with this. My concerns, Mr. Chairman, are attempted to be outlined through this amendment. And what this amendment seeks to ensure is that the Department of Homeland Security would have adequate resources to carry out the research mandated in this legislation, in this bill. The ongoing border security research at the Department of Homeland Security is vital to our national security. I think that's something that we all agree with and should continue. However, border security research cannot take place if we are not willing to provide the department with the financial resources that it needs to carry it out. And that question may be, well, we're not talking about appropriations in this bill, so how can that be? Just a few weeks ago, the House considered the FY 2012 Homeland Security Appropriations Bill. That bill slashed funding for the Science and Technology Directorate, reducing funding for research and development activities by an astonishing 77%. So as we talk about being serious about advancing technologies for being serious and strong on border security, a few weeks ago, that budget was slashed by 77%. And so what I hope is that we can find some agreement that we want to make sure that the language in this legislation would be matched up with the financial means for the Department of Homeland Security Science and Technology Directorate to carry this out, because this is important work. And I hope that this is something that we can all stand together on. This comes on the heels of a double-digit cut to the Directorate's funding in the FY11 continuing resolution. So that was 18.6% of a reduction. So this last budget, 77% reduction, on top of an 18.6% reduction, and then we're going to tell the Department of Homeland Security, well, you need to do all this stuff, but you're not going to have the financial means to do it. I don't think you can say that you want them to carry that out without the financial means to be able to do that. The Homeland Security Director has analyzed the impact of the proposed FY 2012 appropriations bill and found that if the funding level were enacted, it would be forced to eliminate all border security research mandated in this legislation. And that amendment or that outline is pretty astonishing when it carries out all of the areas, with the exception of the aviation work, that has to be eliminated from the Department of Homeland Security Directorate. And I think that's something that we need to pay close attention to. The truth is that the cuts that are being proposed have consequences and will force trade-offs with real-world impact. And I don't think that's in a position where we want to be right now as we talk about the importance of border security. You can't make a choice between how important aviation security is compared to Homeland Security's responsibilities with border security. It seems irresponsible to put new funding mandates on the department and then simultaneously cut the legs out from under them on their budget. Border security research is important, and it's research DHS wants to continue. So let's give them the tools they need to continue it, which is money and not unfunded mandates. My amendment simply says that if the amount appropriated in a fiscal year is not equal to or greater than the amount appropriated in FY11 continuing resolution, the research activities mandated in this bill are no longer required. So it's a common sense way of saying, look, we want you to do the work, but make sure that you have the financial means to carry it out. So with that being said, Mr. Chairman, I hope that the Department of Homeland Security is not going to be forced to have to choose between aviation security and border security. I think we want them to carry both of these important efforts out, especially as we talked about the unfortunate incident back in 2009 with the underwear bomber. What we need to do on the border now to make sure we have adequate technology and science and technology directorates as well. And this is something that we should push forward. So I urge adoption of the amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman for his amendment, and I appreciate Mr. Lujan for acknowledging that the Department of Homeland Security currently faces a challenging budget environment. However, I have reservations about this amendment. The legislation before us organizes ongoing research and development activities at the DH Science and Technology Directorate, codifying programs that will substantially improve the security of our nation's borders. Mr. Lujan's amendment will prevent the Directorate from conducting the research activities identified in this legislation, unless funding for the overall Science and Technology Directorate is appropriated at fiscal FY 2011 levels or higher. Furthermore, the amendment will prevent the reauthorization of the DHS Science and Technology Advisory Committee, an independent advisory body that encourages greater cooperation between DHS and the private sector. My colleagues may recall that at a hearing before the subcommittee in March, witnesses testified to the importance of the advisory committee, citing the need to leverage expertise and insight from outside the department. It is Congress's responsibility to guide the program priorities. I therefore oppose this gentleman's amendment and urge my colleagues to do so as well. I just want to kind of reiterate that what we're doing, as Mr. Lujan did point out, this is not an appropriations process, this is not an appropriations bill, yet it is our ability to actually show where the money that will be appropriated should be spent and prioritize it in that manner. That's where the focus should be. I believe that this directorate is an important part of DHS going forward. I think that it'll provide some very good guidance going forward, and that's why, even though this is merely an authorization bill for the appropriated funds that have been gone through, this is where we should be having the focus. So I thank the gentleman for his amendment, but I urge my colleagues to vote against it. Is there any other discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the gentleman from New Mexico for this very good amendment, and I intend to support it. Research is very, very important. It is the prerogative, it is the job of Congress to help the executive branch set priorities. And the problem in this legislation is that it really robs Peter to pay Paul, and there's a problem in setting priorities. In one particular instance, aviation security is the only research which is going to continue to be funded, and it is about of the same magnitude as the mandated research in this particular bill. So if Homeland Security performs all the research that we're going to mandate that they do in this bill, the Science and Directorate is going to have to eviscerate aviation security, and I doubt that we want them to do that. And I don't think that we are properly setting priorities when we send them mixed signals like this. And with that, and the gentleman's amendment, the gentleman from New Mexico's amendment, simply says, maybe we ought to hold off here for a little bit until we properly set priorities. And with that, I would like to yield to the gentleman from New Mexico.
I appreciate the ranking member for yielding very much, and I think that we need to correct something. My amendment does not prevent the Department of Homeland Security Science and Tech Directorate from doing anything. As a matter of fact, if you look at the FY12 analysis of work that the Science and Tech Directorate was doing, a lot of this work that we're talking about mandating in this legislation is already work that's being done there. Sadly, based on the analysis of the FY 2012 budget, if you look at this sheet, this first page talks about aviation projects which still will continue to be worked and kept. Sadly, when you turn the page and we talk about tunnel detection, tunnel activity monitoring, land border security, all eliminated. Maritime border security, these 6 programs, all eliminated. Cargo security, all eliminated. Bioagent detection, all eliminated. Bioagent threat assessment, all eliminated. Bioagent attack resiliency, all eliminated. Chemical detection, all eliminated. Chemical threat assessments, all eliminated. Chemical attack resiliency, all eliminated. Explosives detection, all eliminated. And this goes on and on and on, even to the point where we talk about natural disaster resiliency. Again, all eliminated. These are all programs and projects that take place at the Science and Tech Directorate based on this FY12 budget. Mr. Chairman, all that I'm saying is, it's one thing to go home and say, we're going to be tough on border security, but it's another thing to make sure that they're going to have the ability to carry this out. Again, this does not prevent the Science and Tech Directorate from doing anything. It allows them to continue this work. All that I'm suggesting is that they should not be mandated to do these programs until they have the financial means to carry them out. These are important projects, and I just hope that we can be clear on this as well. So appreciate the time again, Mr. Chairman, and thanks the ranking member for the time.
reclaiming my time, I want to reiterate that this amendment merely ensures that the Directorate has the funding it needs to carry out the various research priorities that it has. It is a good amendment, and I urge its adoption. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Is there further discussion on the amendment? If no, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. No. Appears the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, can I have a recorded vote?
The clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Quayle. Chairman Quayle votes no. Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith votes no. Mrs. Biggert. Mr. Nagelbauer. Mr. Nagelbauer votes no. Mr. McCall. Mr. McCall votes no. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman votes no. Mr. Ridgel. Mr. Ridgel votes no. Mr. Hallgren. Mr. Hallgren votes no. Mr. Korvac. Mr. Korvac votes no. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes no. Mr. Wu. Mr. Wu votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Ms. Wilson. Ms. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Lipinski votes aye. Ms. Giffords. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes aye. Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson votes aye.
Are there any other members who wish to vote? The gentlelady from Illinois.
Mrs. Biggert. Mrs. Biggert votes no.
Are there any other members who wish to vote? Are there members who wish to change their vote? The clerk shall report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 7 members vote aye and 10 members vote no.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other amendments to the bill? For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to go back and correct the former vote.
Yep. Yes.
I had 6 members voting aye and 10 members voting no. Is that correct?
Yes, that's what we have as well.
I think I said 7.
Okay.
I like that to be correct.
Well, the record will reflect 6 voted aye and 10 voted no, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Thank you.
The clerk will report the amendment at the desk.
Amendment to H.R. 2463 offered by Mr. Lujan of New Mexico.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I was optimistic, Mr. Chairman, that that last amendment might pass and that we may not need this one. But since that amendment failed, we'll continue with Amendment 27. And this amendment, Mr. Chairman, I hope that we can have some agreement on in the good discussion that we just had pertaining to the importance of being able to get this critical work done and supporting it at Department of Homeland Security. There's no doubt that the proposed cuts to the S&T Directorate have an impact on its ability to carry out its mission fully and effectively. An analysis of the proposed FY 2012 Homeland Security Appropriations Bill done by the Department of Homeland Security shows that under the proposed funding level, the Director will be forced to eliminate close to 150 ongoing research projects, some of which I named, including all the bioagent detection research, explosive detections research, natural disaster resiliency research, first responder research, cybersecurity research, and we know the critical concerns that we have there with cyber crimes with the country now and the dollars that are lost and the threat to businesses all over America, and all border security research. If this bill is enacted, it will force the Directorate to fund border security research without resources. And that means one of two things will likely happen. The Directorate will have to put the small amount of its remaining research funding away from aviation security and spread it around as little as they have, or the Directorate will have to scrape the bottom of its couch cushions to find a minuscule amount of support to put towards this research, which we know is not a good idea because that'll set up this research for failure. As the committee that purportedly cares about the quality of the research coming out of our research agencies, and I know we do, Mr. Chairman, I think we need to have the full understanding of what impact declining funding levels might be having on research. This amendment, again, is a simple, common sense amendment that will help ensure that we appreciate the full implications of decisions to slash research budgets by requiring that, in the reports mandated in Section 8 and Section 9, the Directorate include an assessment of the impact that any decline in funding levels between FY11 and FY12 has had on the ability of the Directorate to carry out that specific research. So again, Mr. Chairman, this is just a simple way of saying, please let us know with those reduced funding levels for FY12, what aren't you going to be able to do to carry out the mandates as prescribed, so that way we're able to protect our borders, we're able to provide support for natural disaster, our first responders, chemical agent problems that we may have, and making sure we're able to support cybersecurity. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I urge adoption of this amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman for his amendment, and I do appreciate his desire to evaluate the potential impact of the funding level at the Science and Technology Directorate. However, I do think that basing an amendment on the fiscal year 2012 budget is a little premature, as we've really not completed the budget process. And I'm also concerned that including this information will take the focus away from the original purpose of these reports. So for those reasons, I must oppose the gentleman's amendment. Is there any further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to thank the gentleman from New Mexico for this good and common sense amendment, because I do believe that it is very important for us to at least know the impact of these budget cuts. And I believe that these reports that we request will be coming a little ways down the pike. When we do know the impact of these reduced funding levels, we want to know. We want to know what the impact is on reduced funding levels, anti-counterfeit technologies, biometric technologies, and the other things that the Science and Technology Directorate are working on are very, very important. And I wouldn't, if there is a dramatic impact on the quality of work being done at the S&T Directorate, I think that this committee would want to know that. This is the Science and Technology Committee. We want to be very data-driven. Mr. Chairman, I would hope that if you are not able to accept this amendment today, that you would work with the gentleman from New Mexico between here and the full committee, Mark, to work something out so that we can have proper feedback of the effects of the legislation which we pass. And I'd be happy to yield to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. The one thing that we have is that during the process, it's a little premature because the 2012 budgeting process isn't over yet. The other thing is that if we continue to, every time that we talk about spending reductions and the like, and we have to have up in arms about any spending reductions, we're never going to get out of the hole that we have dug ourselves in. And it's not on parties; it's both parties that have dug the hole. But I would be willing to work with Mr. Lujan to find language that could be acceptable and get that through at the full committee markup. I'd be happy to work with Mr. Lujan going forward on that.
If the chairman
And
I yield back.
And reclaiming my time, I thank the chairman for his willingness, and I just want to add that I am in favor of studying not only the effect of cuts, but also whether ads are efficacious. So, I think both of those need to be looked at, and I'd be happy to yield to the gentleman from New Mexico.
Mr. Chairman, with that being said, I'd be happy to withdraw this amendment this time so that we can work on this together and then see how we can approach this as we get to full committee.
Thank you, and yield back.
The amendment is withdrawn, and I thank the gentleman for withdrawing his amendment. I look forward to working with him on language that will be effective. Are there any other amendments? Hearing none, the question is on H.R. 2463, the Border Security Technology Innovation Act of 2011, as amended. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. I will now recognize myself to offer a motion. Without objection, so ordered. I will now recognize myself to offer a motion. I move that the subcommittee favorably report HR 2463 as amended to the full committee. Furthermore, I move that staff be instructed to prepare the subcommittee report and make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill as amended in accordance with the recommendations of the subcommittee. Questions on the motion to report the bill favorably? Those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it, and the resolution is favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. I move that members have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplemental, minority, or additional views on the measure. Without objection, so ordered. This concludes the subcommittee markup. The chair declares the subcommittee adjourned.
Nicely done, Ben. Just expressing willingness to work with a member, even if you can't work it out.
Yeah.
Just